The complete shorter fiction. In this very curious age, when we are beginning to require pictures of people, their minds and their codes, a faithful outline, drawn with no skill but veracity, may possibly have some value. Let each man, I heard it said the other day, write down the details of a day's work. Posterity will be as glad of the catalogue as we should be if we had such a record of how the doorkeeper at the Globe and the man who kept the park gates passed Saturday, March 18th in the year of our Lord 1568. And as such portraits as we have are almost invariably of the male sex who strut more prominently across the age. It seems worthwhile to take as model one of those many women who cluster in the shade, for a study of history and biography convinces any right-minded person that these obscure figures occupy a place not unlike that of the showman's hand in the dance of the marionettes, and the finger is laid upon the heart. It is true that our simple eyes believed for many ages that the figures danced of their own accord and cut what steps they chose, and the partial light which novelists and historians have begun to cast upon that dark and crowded place behind the scenes has done little as yet but show us how many wires there are, held in obscure hands, upon whose jerk or twist the whole figure of the dance depends. This preface leads us then to the point at which we began. We intend to look as steadily as we can at a little group which lives at this moment, the 20th June 1906, and seems for some reason which we will give to epitomize the qualities of many. It is a common case because after all there are many young women born of well-to-do, respectable, official parents, and they must all meet much the same problems, and there can be, unfortunately, but little variety in the answers they make. There are 5 of them. All daughters, they will ruefully explain to you, regretting this initial mistake, it seems all through their lives on their parents' behalf. Further, they are divided into camps. 2 sisters oppose themselves to 2 sisters. The 5th vacillates equally between them. Nature has decreed that 2 shall inherit a stalwart, pugnacious frame of mind, which applies itself to political economy and social problems successfully, and not unhappily, while the other 2 she has made frivolous, domestic of lighter and more sensitive temperaments. These 2 then are condemned to be what in the slang of the century is called the daughters at home. Their sisters deciding to cultivate their brains, go to college, do well there, and marry professors. Their careers have so much likeness to those of men themselves that it is scarcely worthwhile to make them the subject of special inquiry. The 5th sister is less marked in the character than any of the others, but she marries when she is 22, so that she scarcely has time to develop the individual features of young ladydom which we set out to describe. In the 2 daughters at home, Phyllis and Rosamond, we will call them, we find excellent material for our inquiry. A few facts will help us to set them in their places before we begin to investigate. Phyllis is 28, Rosamond is 24. In person, they are pretty, pink-cheeked, vivacious. A curious eye will not find any regular beauty of feature, but their dress and demeanor give them the effect of beauty without its substance. They seem indigenous to the drawing-room, as though born in silk evening robes. They had never trod a rougher earth than the Turkey carpet, or reclined on harsher ground than the armchair or the sofa. To see them in a drawing-room full of well-dressed men and women is to see the merchant in the stock exchange or the barrister in the temple. This every motion and word proclaims is their native air, their place of business, their professional arena. Here, clearly they practice the arts in which they have been instructed since childhood. Here, perhaps they win their victories and earn their bread, but it would be as unjust as it would be easy to press their metaphor till it suggested that the comparison was appropriate and complete in all its parts. It fails, but where it fails and why it fails, it will take some time and attention to discover. You must be in a position to follow these young ladies home and to hear their comments over the bedroom candle. You must be by them when they wake next morning, and you must attend their progress throughout the day. When you have done this, not for one day but for many days, then you will be able to calculate the values of those impressions which are to be received by night in the drawing room. This much may be retained of the metaphor already used, that the drawing room scene represents work to them and not play. So much is made quite clear by the scene in the carriage going home. Lady Hibbert is a severe critic of such performances. She has noted whether her daughters looked well, spoke well, behaved well, whether they attracted the right people and repelled the wrong, whether on the whole the impression they left was favorable. From the multiplicity and minuteness of her comment, it is easy to see that 2 hours' entertainment is, for artists of this kind, a very delicate and complicated piece of work. Much, it seems, depends upon the way they acquit themselves. The daughter answers submissively and then keeps silence, whether their mother praises or blames, and her censure is severe when they are alone at last, and they share a modest-sized bedroom at the top of a great ugly house. They stretch their arms and begin to sigh with relief. Their talk is not very edifying. It is the shop of businessmen. They calculate their profits and their losses, and have clearly no interest at heart except their own. And yet you may have heard them chatter of books and plays and pictures as though these were the things they most care about. To discuss themselves was the only motive of a party. Yet you will observe also in this hour of unlovely condo something which is also very sincere but by no means ugly. The sisters were frankly fond of each other. Their affection has taken the form for the most part of free masonship, which is anything but sentimental. All their hopes and fears are in common, but it is a genuine feeling, profound in spite of its prosaic exterior. They are strictly honorable in all their dealings together, and there is even something chivalrous in the attitude of the younger sister to the elder. She, as the weaker by reason of her greater age, must always have the best of things. There is some pathos also in the gratitude with which Phyllis accepts the advantage, but it grows late, and in respect for their complexions, these businesslike young women remind each other that it is time to put out the light. In spite of this fordo, they are fain to sleep on after they are called in the morning. But Rosamond jumps up and shakes Phyllis. "Phyllis, we shall be late for breakfast." There must have been some force in this argument, for Phyllis got out of bed and began silently to dress, but their haste allowed them to put on their clothes with great care and dexterity, and the result was scrupulously surveyed by each sister in turn before they went down. The clock struck 9 as they came into the breakfast room. Their father was already there, kissed each daughter perfunctorily, passed his cup for coffee, read his paper, and disappeared. It was a silent meal. Lady Hibbert breakfasted in her room, but after breakfast they had to visit her, to receive her orders for the day, and while one wrote notes for the other, went down, arranged lunch and dinner with the cook. By 11 they were free, for the time, and met in schoolroom where Doris, the youngest sister, aged 16, was writing an essay upon the Magna Carta in French. Her complaints at the interruption, for she was dreaming of a first class already, met with no honor. "We must sit here, because there is nowhere else to sit," remarked Rosamond. "You needn't think we want your company," added Phyllis, but these remarks were spoken without bitterness as the mere commonplaces of a daily life. In deference to their sister, however, Phyllis took up a volume of Anatole France and Rosamond opened the Greek studies of Walter Pater. They read for some minutes in silence. Then a maid knocked, breathless, with a message that her ladyship wanted the young ladies in the drawing-room. They groaned. Rosamond offered to go alone. Phyllis said no. They were both victims, and wondering what the errand was. They went sulkily downstairs. Lady Hibbert was impatiently waiting them. "Oh, there you are at last," she exclaimed. "Your father has sent round to say he asked Mr. Middleton and Sir Thomas Carew to lunch. Isn't that troublesome of him? I can't think what drove him to ask them. And there's no lunch. And I see you haven't arranged the flowers, Phyllis. And Rosamond, I want you to put a clean tucker in my maroon gown. Oh dear, how thoughtless men are." The daughters were used to these insinuations against their father. On the whole, they took his side, but they never said so. They silently departed now on their separate errands. Phyllis had to go out and buy flowers and an extra dish for lunch, and Rosamond sat down to her sewing. Their tasks were hardly done in time for them to change for lunch, but at 1:30 they came pink and smiling into the pompous great drawing-room. Mr. Middleton was Sir William Hibbert's secretary, a young man of some position and prospect, as Lady Hibbert defined him, who might be encouraged. Sir Thomas was an official in the same office, solid and gouty, and a handsome piece on the board, but of no individual importance. At lunch, then, there was some sprightly conversation between Mr. Middleton and Phyllis, while their elders talked platitudes in sonorous deep voices. Rosamond sat rather silent, as was her wont, speculating keenly upon the character of the secretary, who might be her brother-in-law, and checking certain theories she had made by every fresh word he spoke. By open consent, Mr. Middleton was her sister's game. She did not trespass, if one could have heard her thoughts, while she listened to Sir Thomas' stories of India in the 60s. One would have found that she was busied in somewhat obscure calculations. Little Middleton, as she called him, was not half a bad sort. He had brains. He was, she knew, a good son. He would make a good husband. He was well-to-do also, and would make his way in the service. On the other hand, her psychological acuteness told her that he was narrow-minded, without a trace of imagination or intellect, in the sense she understood it, and she knew enough of her sister to know that she would never love this efficient, active little man, although she would respect him. The question was, should she marry him? This was the point she had reached when Lord Mayo was assassinated, and while her lips murmured ohs and ahs of horror, her eyes were telegraphing across the table, "I am doubtful." If she had nodded, her sister would have begun to practice those arts by which many proposals had been secured already. Rosamond, however, did not yet know enough to make up her mind. She telegraphed merely, "Keep him in play." The gentleman left soon after lunch, and Lady Hibbert prepared to go and lie down, but before she went, she called Phyllis to her. "Well, my dear," she said, with more affection than she had shown yet, "did you have a pleasant lunch? Was Mr. Middleton agreeable?" She patted her daughter's cheek and looked keenly into her eyes. Some petulancy came across Phyllis, and she answered listlessly, "Oh, he's not a bad little man, but he doesn't excite me." Lady Hibbert's face changed at once. If she had seemed a benevolent cat playing with a mouse from philanthropic motives before, she was the real animal now in sober earnest. "Remember," she snapped, "this can't go on forever. Try and be a little less selfish, my dear." If she had sworn openly, her words could not have been less pleasant to her. She was swept off, and the two girls looked at each other with expressive contortions of the lips. "I couldn't help it," said Phyllis, laughing weakly. "Now let's have a respite. Her ladyship won't want us till 4. They mounted to the schoolroom, which was now empty, and threw themselves into deep armchairs. Phyllis lit a cigarette, and Rosamond sucked peppermints, as though they induced the two thought. "Well, my dear," said Phyllis at last, "what do we decide? It is June now. Our parents give me till July. Little Middleton is the only one." Except, began Rosamond. Yes, but it is no good thinking of him. Poor old Phyllis. Well, he is not a bad man. Clean, sober, truthful, industrious. Oh, we should make a model pair. You should stay with us in Derbyshire. You might do better, went on Rosamond, with the considering air of a judge. On the other hand, they won't stand much more. They intimated Sir William and Lady Hibbert. Father asked me yesterday what I could do if I didn't marry. I had nothing to say. No, we were educated for marriage. You might have done something better. Of course, Pym a fool, so it doesn't matter. And I think marriage the best thing there is, if one were allowed to marry the man one wants. Oh, I know, it is beastly. Still, there is no escaping facts. Middleton, said Rosamond briefly. He is the facts at present. Do you care for him? Not in the least. Could you marry him? If her ladyship made me. It might be a way out at any rate. What do you make of him now? Asked Phyllis. Who would have accepted or rejected any man on the strength of her sister's advice? Rosamond, possessed of shrewd and capable brains, had been driven to feed them exclusively upon the human character, and as her sign was but little obscured by personal prejudice, her results were generally trustworthy. He is very good, she began. Moral qualities, excellent brains, fair. He'll do well, of course, not a scrap of imagination or romance. He'd be very just to you. In short, we would be a worthy pair, something like our parents. The question is, went on Rosamond, is it worthwhile going throughout another year of slavery till the next one comes along? And who's the next? Simpson? Rogers? At each name her sister made a face. The conclusion seems to be mark time and keep up appearances. Oh, let's enjoy ourselves while we may. If it weren't for you, Rosamond, I should have married a dozen times already. You'd have been in the divorce court, my dear. I am too respectable for that. Really, I am very weak without you. And now let's talk of your affairs. My affairs can wait, said Rosamond resolutely, and the two young women discussed their friends' characters with some acuteness and not a little charity till it was time to change once more. But two features of their talk are worth remark. First, that they held intellect in a great reverence and made that a cardinal point in their inquiry. Secondly, that whenever they suspect an unhappy home life or a disappointed attachment, even in the case of the least attractive, their judgments were invariably gentle and sympathetic. At 4, they drove out with Lady Hibbert to pay calls. This performance consisted in driving solemnly to one house after another, where they had dined or hoped to dine, and depositing 2 or 3 cards in the servant's hand. At one place they entered and drank a cup of tea, and talked of the weather for precisely 15 minutes. They wound up with a slow passage throughout the park, making one of those procession of gay carriage which travel at a foot's pace at that hour round the statue of Achilles. Lady Hibbert wore permanent and immutable smile. By 6 o'clock they were home again and found Sir William entertaining an elderly cousin and his wife at tea. These people could be treated without ceremony, and Lady Hibbert went off to lie down, and left her daughters to ask how John was and whether Milly had got over the measles. Remember, we dine out at 8, William, she said, as she left the room. Phyllis went with them. The party was given by a distinguished judge, and she had to entertain a respectable K.C. Her efforts in one direction at least might be relaxed, and her mother's eye regarded her with indifference. It was like a draught of clear cold water. Phyllis reflected to talk with an intelligent elderly man upon impersonal subject. They did not theorize, but he told her facts, and she was glad to realize that the world was full of solid things which we were independent of her life. When they left, she told her mother that she was going on to the Tristram's to meet Rosamond there. Lady Hibbert pursed up her mouth, shrugged her shoulders, and said, "Very well," as though she would have objected if she could have laid her hands on a sufficiently good reason. But Sir William was waiting, and a frown was the only argument. So Phyllis went separately to the distant and unfashionable quarter of London where the Tristrams lived. That was on one of the many enviable parts of their lot. The stucco fronts, the irreproachable rows of Belgravia and South Kensington, seemed to Phyllis the type of her lot, of a life trained to grow in an ugly pattern to match the staid ugliness of its fellows. But if one lived here in Bloomsbury, she began to theorize, waving with her hand as her cab passed through the great tranquil squares, beneath the pale green of umbrageous trees, and might grow up as one liked. There was room and freedom, and in the roar and splendor of the Strand she read the live realities of the world from which her stucco and her pillars protected her so completely. Her cab stopped before some lighted windows which, open in the summer night, let some of the talk and life within spill out upon the pavement. She was impatient for the door to open which was to let her enter and partake. When she stood, however, within the room, she became conscious of her own appearance, which, as she knew by heart, was on these occasions like that of ladies whom Romney painted. She saw herself enter into the smoky room where people sat on the floor, and the host wore a shooting jacket, with her arch little head held high and her mouth pursed as though for an epigram. Her white silk and her cherry ribbons made her conspicuous. It was with some feeling of the difference between her and the rest that she sat very silently, scarcely taking advantage of the openings that were made for her in the talk. She kept looking round at the dozen people who were sitting there, with a sense of bewilderment. The talk was of certain pictures then being shown, and their merits were discussed from a somewhat technical standpoint. Where was Phyllis to begin? She had seen them, but she knew that her platitudes would never stand the test of question and criticism to which they would be exposed. Nor, she knew, was there any scope here for those feminine graces which could wail so much. The time was past, for the discussion was hot and serious, and no one of the combatants wished to be tripped by illogical devices. So she sat and watched, feeling like a bird with wings pinioned, and more actually because more genuinely uncomfortable than she had ever been at ball or play. She repeated to herself the little bitter axiom that she had fallen between two stools, and tried meanwhile to use her brain soberly upon what was being said. Rosamond hinted from across the room that she was in the same predicament. At least the disputations dissolved and talk became general once more, but no one apologized for the concentrated character it had borne, and general conversation, the Miss Hibberts found, if it did occupy itself with more trivial subjects, tended to be scornful of the commonplace, and knew no hesitation in saying so. But it was amusing, and Rosamond acquitted herself creditably in discussing a certain character which came into question, although she was surprised to find that her most profound discoveries were taken as the starting point of further investigations and represented no conclusions. Moreover, the Miss Hibberts were surprised and a little dismayed to discover how much of their education had stuck to them. Phyllis could have beaten herself the next moment for her instinctive disapproval of some jest against Christianity, which the Tristams uttered and applauded as lightly as though religion was a small matter. Even more amazing to the Miss Hibberts, however, was the manner in which their own department of business was transacted, for they supposed that even in this odd atmosphere the facts of life were important. Miss Tristram, a young woman of great beauty and an artist of real promise, was discussing marriage with a gentleman who might easily, as far as one could judge, have a personal interest in the question, but the freedom and frankness with which they both explained their views and theorized upon the whole question of love and matrimony seemed to put the whole thing in a new and sufficiently startling light. It fascinated the young ladies more than anything they had yet seen or heard. They had flattered themselves that every side and view of the subject was known to them, but this was something only new, but unquestionably genuine.